Hello, 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 and
Hi.
welcome to another episode of Little Life, Big Loss. We have the beautiful Beck here today. Beck is Archie's mum, and I believe you're mum of quite a few little kitties, so we'll
Yes,
definitely
we
get
are.
into
So
that.
lots of kids here. Yeah.
Uh,
So
Amazing. I can't wait to hear your story. So Beck and I met, well, we haven't met, but just not too long ago. When did we lose little Archie? Just in December.
December. Yeah.
And how did it happen again? Somebody messaged me, and we organised the. Or did you message me?
I messaged you. So I think it was like 3 days after I lost Archie, and I was in this place of like there's no one around. And I know that sounds odd. It was like people were
Mm,
checking in but didn't really know what to say.
yeah.
And I didn't really know how to go about living, I guess.
Mm,
And I remember sending you a message saying, like, I've lost my son and how do I survive? And I
mm,
think you said to me that you sent a message when you lost Milli to someone saying, how do you breathe? And I was like,
mm,
oh, she gets it. Like, there's,
mm,
she gets it. And that
yeah.
was my
Yeah.
focus. It was like every single day was just like, how am I going to survive? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of how, because I had been following you on Instagram, obviously I hadn't engaged with you, but yeah, and I just thought, let's just send a message and see what happens. And that's what I
And
did.
you are, yeah, and you were on the Central Coast, and I remember feeling like, oh my gosh, I feel so helpless because I'm so far away from you. But then I was like, wait, I know a lot of people on the Central Coast, and so I just kind
Yeah.
of went to Instagram and said, can we create a meal train for this lady? And she's just lost her baby, and who can get on board and who can go knock on her door and clean her house or take her food or all sorts of things. And so I was so
And I had
stoked
like
that.
so many people that I didn't know that were dropping food to our door. One lady like made this bear that had Archie's name on it, and she was like, I'm sorry if this is not the right thing to do, but I felt it was the right thing to do. And that bear
Oh,
still is in our living room, like it's still there. So it
I think
was,
that was my friend
you know,
Jess. Was it
yes, I
Jess?
think so, yeah.
Oh my God, she's an
Um,
amazing human.
so it was just we had all these people that we didn't know that were just dropping stuff at our door, and I was getting messages from people saying, do you want to talk or do you want to have coffee or, um, so yeah, it was different for me because normally I'm the giver and to be on the receiving end was really
Yeah.
nice. Just to know that people were there and cared. So
And I think that was the biggest thing I was saying to people. I was like, I just don't want this lady to feel alone because
yeah,
it's the last thing that I want anyone to feel is alone because sadly
yeah,
we're not alone. We are so many people in this community, but even the people that were helping you haven't experienced loss. But
that's right.
and I think also because they were a lot of my friends from the Central Coast who probably felt quite useless when we lost Millie because they weren't
Yeah,
close. So I think it
yeah,
was their way of being like, oh, I can help do the things that I wasn't able to do for Rochelle, and so let's help this lady. And I love
yeah.
that, and I know that my old church got involved, and I believe they brought meals as well and
They did. Yeah,
reached out to you. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So it was very kind. So I'm very grateful for that.
so
Yeah.
good. And so I'll get into the podcast and start by I definitely want to hear we don't always do this, but sometimes we do, and I want to hear like the journey of all of your kids and then leading into
Yeah.
Archie. But first my question is always who was Beck before she experienced baby loss?
Oh, I feel like obviously I was a mum. I had my own kids. I had stepkids. I was working. I am working again, but um, the person I was, and the one that I am now is very, very different. Um, and not in a bad way. I think I appreciate my children more, and I've always appreciated, but you appreciate them more. Um, and I never once I knew, baby loss is common. It's more common than people give it credit for. So I knew
Yeah.
that. I just never thought it would be me. And I had had miscarriages before, so I'd
Yeah.
been on the receiving end of that, but not like this, you know. This was next level, and it changes your priorities and it changes what's important. Um, so, yeah, I'm not who I was, but as I said, it's not in a bad way. It's just, you
Yeah.
know, the puzzle's been ripped apart and put back together in a different way. That's probably
Yeah.
the best way to put it.
That's lovely.
um,
And I think I said it in one of our episodes, like broken broken isn't bad. Like broken can
yeah,
be beautiful.
that's right.
And yeah, it's we always are so different after, and sometimes it
Yeah,
doesn't turn out so beautiful yet, or sometimes we're still in that broken, not so beautiful space. But
yeah.
I love
I
that
think one thing
you
that
know,
was important for me was because we had, or we have our other kids, I didn't want to be stuck in like the depressiveness of grief.
yeah,
And I always say, like, it's okay to grieve, and everyone's grief is different. So this is just my personal experience, but everyone's grief is different. But for me, it was important that I tried to find the good in every day, even if it was a small amount. And at the beginning, it was terrible. Like, I didn't want to get out of bed. And, you know, my kids survived on McDonald's for a week. And
yeah.
I remember messaging like one of my best friends, and she lives far away. And I said to my kids are eating Macca's again. And she said, if that's the worst thing that you're worried about, they're fine. They're going to survive, you know? And I
Yeah,
was like,
yeah,
okay, well, let's just get Macca's again. like,
yeah,
and it's just what you have to do to get through, you know?
absolutely.
But for me, it was a very big thing of mind over matter that I had to try very hard because I knew if I didn't, I would be stuck in the depressiveness of it, of not being
Yeah,
able to function. And I
yeah,
didn't want that for my other kids. Um, so that was, I guess, my driving force about how to, you know, and we've got kids that range from 11 months. So I had Harrison in May last year and fell pregnant 6 weeks later, and then gave birth to Archie in December. So I had two pregnancies and a labour in 12 months, which
oof,
is insane.
yeah,
um,
yeah,
so, you know, we've got kids from 11 months ago up all the way to 21. So trying, like, navigating how they feel, they're all different. Like, out of everyone, I think my 6-year-old is the one that feels it the most. She wants to hold Archie's ashes. She'll cry
mm,
for him. She'll ask why
mm,
couldn't he stay, and then it'll be days where she doesn't, like, every night she'll say goodnight to him and she's fine, she's happy to do that,
mm.
and then all of a sudden it hits her like a ton of bricks and she's an emotional mess. um you know, even this morning she asked me, does this happen to other people? And I said, what do you mean? And she said,
Mm,
well, do other people lose their babies? And I said, yeah, they do. I said, it's common. um and that's probably one thing that with all of them is that I've been very open and honest, obviously age
yeah,
appropriate, but open and honest about, because it's impacted them too. It's not just me and my husband. So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
It's such a wild ride. I quite often talk about the impacts when somebody loses a child and that they have kids at home.
yeah,
Because for me, like, I struggle still 9 months on to get out of bed and to have
yeah,
motivation and to
yeah,
do things. And I make myself do it, and then I might sleep for a day. Like,
yeah,
you know, if I didn't have this podcast today, I went to yoga this morning and I would have come home and just slept because I'm just like,
yeah,
I just can't even deal with the world today. And this is
yeah,
why I love the podcast, because it does make me not do those things, and it gives me
yeah,
the drive to do this. But I say it all the time, you know, when you've got children at home, and some, I know that in the past people have said things like, and this is people who haven't experienced loss, but they have other kids. And I mean, it's a
yeah.
very, and I don't know, Dylan used to think it, and I'm like, it's not, it's, that doesn't make it better. That does
No.
not make, you've still lost a
So
child. And
and like
if
in
anything,
saying that, when
mm,
after I lost Archie, I and I can't remember exactly when it was, but I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I put a photo on Facebook of my daughter and my youngest son, and I got a message from a mum from through my kids that I know through my kids. I don't know her that well. And she said, I'm so glad that you're over your grief, that you're posting happy snaps. And I didn't reply to her because I didn't know what to say. And I thought, is she having a go at me because I've posted the photo and it's like I've forgotten about Archie? Or does she genuinely believe that I'm over it? And I honestly didn't know what to say because I was just like, what do you say to that?
Just
You know?
gobsmacked, yeah. Like you
And
will
I
actually
couldn't,
never, ever be over the grief of Archie.
no, that's right.
Yeah.
And I was just like, maybe she just doesn't understand. And I just couldn't process, like, what do you say back to that? And it was,
Mm,
and for me, it was also like, well, yes, I post photos of my kids and I post photos of Archie and I still talk about him. Like, I don't think there's ever been a day that I haven't spoken about him.
mm,
Um, but like, what am I meant to do? Do I forget about my other kids and don't mention them anymore? Or do I only talk about
yeah.
Archie? Or do I? So it
I
was a
know.
really strange message for me to receive and trying to interpret because I was like, well, I don't know what she's expecting of me. Like,
And then also having to unpack that message of like, you don't even want to say like, I'm sorry, what do you mean? Because then that could open a can of worms of a conversation
that's
that could
right.
be awful, or it
Yeah,
could be nice, or you could come across as a bitch, or
yeah,
whatever it might be. I remember somebody
yeah,
sent me one right at the beginning saying, time heals all wounds. And I wrote,
yeah,
and I just literally replied, and then I felt guilty, but I literally just wrote, I don't think time will ever heal the wound of my daughter dying.
yeah,
Like, and she was like, oh, I'm so sorry. It's just a saying. I said, well, it's a terrible saying and it needs to be abolished.
yeah.
Like, time will never heal my daughter
No,
dying. Even when I have more children, that will not heal my daughter dying. Like,
that's
it's
right. And I agree with that.
nothing. The fact that you have stepkids and young babies and all the things at home does not make Archie dying any easier. Like
No,
there's nothing that ever makes this okay. And I think from all the
yeah.
psychology and counseling sessions we've had, they just say that the grief can feel softer as we grow around it, but it will
I think
continue
you
to
just
come with
learn to
us.
live with it.
Yeah.
You learn to live with it, and every day is different. Some days are good, and some days are bad.
Yeah.
Archie's urn arrived in the mail 2 days ago, and I knew it was coming, and I expected it to be there. But when the postman handed me the box, and I knew what it was like someone just stabbed me in the heart. I prepared myself. I
Mm.
knew it was coming. Um, and obviously unpacking that and putting it up on his shelf and stuff. And I was like, in one way, like it was like reliving everything again. But in the other way, it was probably the first time that I felt like he was properly home, if that makes sense. Like
Mm.
before that, he
That's
was
so
in this
nice.
box that the funeral home gave us, and so
Mm-hmm.
now he's got like his proper space.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you go, well, you've lost your baby, and people think it just ends there, but there's different things that trigger you all this time.
Yeah.
So whether it's receiving an urn or even or arranging a funeral or whatever it is, it's just like it's endless.
And I think forever it will always be like, like the other week it was for me, her would have been her 9 month birthday. And
Yeah,
as stupid as it is, I wanted to do the post of the 9 months in versus 9 months out. You know how people
yeah,
do that post where there's like
yeah.
9 months in the belly and then 9 months holding. And I was like, I don't even get to do that. And then, her first birthday. And then even when she becomes a teenager, like when she would have got her period and all the things that like
I think I've
forever will
lost
be a
you.
reminder when she's, oh, hello? Hello?
Okay, you're back. I don't know what happened. You
Oh,
froze for a sec. You're back.
okay. I might turn my phone Wi-Fi off, because sometimes the Wi-Fi isn't good friends with us. I've even changed to Telstra, and we still seem to have issues. Have you got me?
Okay, you good? Yeah, now I've got you. All good.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Let's pray this works. I have so many. I actually had a beautiful lady the other day offer for me to start using her podcast studio. It's up in
yeah.
Brisbane, so it's about an hour's drive for me. But I was like, oh, I'm not sure if I should. But every time I have technical issues, I'm like, I really should go use that podcast space. Um, yeah, I think just forever and ever and ever, we will always remember them and think of them. And sometimes it will be with, happiness, and sometimes it will be with sadness. And I don't think anything's ever going to change that.
That's right. I agree with that 100%.
And so let's go back to the beginning for you.
Yeah.
Um, obviously we want to hear Archie's story, but I would really just love to hear like your previous pregnancies. You said you've had some miscarriages, you've got
Yeah,
stepchildren.
I do.
Let's talk about becoming a mum for you.
So, I have 4 children earthside, and then I have 3
Mm-hmm.
stepchildren.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when I met my husband, I had 3 kids from my previous marriage. He had 3 kids from his previous marriage, so we became the Brady Bunch. And then we
Mm-hmm.
had Harrison together. So Harrison was born in May last year.
May.
No, yeah, so none of my pregnancies have been easy. I took a long time to fall pregnant with my first, about almost 3 years.
Yeah.
Um, and in the end, had fertility treatment with him. Um, Fell pregnant, had complications in that pregnancy. I had a short cervix.
Yeah.
Um, then he was born okay at 39 weeks. He went into
Yeah.
fetal distress. His heart stopped. They took me for an emergency C-section, and he ended up being born vaginally when I was under a general anaesthetic because he started to crown. So he
Wow.
was out of the norm,
I've never heard of
which
that.
is in,
Wow.
yeah. So it was forceps vacuum episiotomy,
Oh.
because I was asleep and I couldn't push, and they couldn't pull him back up to do the C-section. So it was just like, get this baby out. But thankfully he was fine. It was, I think, traumatic more for me than him, but he was fine.
Mm.
And then I went on to have Zalia almost 2 years later. Pretty crazy pregnancy, but again, short cervix.
Yeah.
And then I had Mia, and she was born almost 3 years later. Um, Again, crazy pregnancy, but short cervix. So the whole
Okay.
way along, I've had short cervix, very quick labours. The longest I've been in labour is an hour. The shortest I've been in labour is 18 minutes, start to finish, which is
Holy shit.
nuts. Yeah. So then I had Harrison, May last year.
Yeah.
Um, Not so crazy pregnancy in the sense that I was very sick at the beginning, had a short cervix, was put on bed rest in hospital from 34 weeks.
Okay.
I was on progesterone to try and bide my time.
Yeah.
Um, and then he was born at 38 weeks. So I spent 4 weeks in hospital. He was born 38 weeks, 18 minutes. He was done,
Holy
which is
shit.
crazy.
Absolutely
So,
crazy.
and then I've got 3 stepkids, who are 16, 19, and 21.
Yep.
So we've got all the ages.
How old are your oldest three?
So Blake is 12, Zalia is 10, and Mia is 6.
Yeah. And then we've got 11 months
Yeah.
on.
And then 11-month-old Harrison.
Yeah.
So after I had Harrison, we kind of said that we might have one more and that would be it. I fell pregnant unexpectedly. We weren't planning to. So I fell pregnant. I'm pretty sure it was 6 weeks afterwards. I went to my
Literally
obstetrician.
must have been your first period back, like your
Yeah,
first.
yeah. And then
Yep.
went to my obstetrician, and he was like, holy crap. He's like, no judgment from me, but, and it was funny because from the beginning he was like, you have to be prepared that having a baby so quickly after having Harrison, given that I've had short cervix before, you have to be mindful there's a chance that you'll go into early labor. But I did not, at that point in time, didn't think early labor was going to be at 22 weeks. I thought, maybe 30 weeks, 35 weeks, but,
Okay.
so
Did
I
the
was on
OB
progesterone.
did the OB think that it could have been this severe or dangerous, or he was just thinking, was that where he was
No, I
meaning
think
that
no, I don't think so. I think he was just saying, in some cases it is common with women that have had a baby that it can happen
35
again.
weeks or something? Okay.
Yeah, so it was not. Um, and he said, we'll just monitor it, and he put me on progesterone, which I had with the other pregnancies as well, just as a precaution.
Mm,
Um, Most people take it till about 13 weeks. I've always taken it a lot longer. Um, and then I had an appointment with him, I think around 16 weeks or something. And I said to him the progesterone was like really irritating me and I wanted to just give it a break for a little bit. And he was okay with that. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. We should not have stopped the progesterone.
mm,
Um, we went overseas. We went to Fiji. We took all the kids on a holiday. I was fine. There was no issues. Um, we got back. So I would have been around 21 weeks, I think, or 20 weeks then.
yeah.
And I guess because I had miscarriages. So after I had Mia and before I had Harrison, we had multiple miscarriages in that time.
Hmm.
Um, so I was always a bit cautious, even with Harrison, of, we need to just wait till he's here. And then with
Yeah.
Archie, same. I when I got to 20 weeks, I kind of felt like, okay, well, we've hit a milestone now. We're okay. So
Yeah.
we went and put a pram on lay-by, like a double pram, because I was like, yep, we're good now, we're fine.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that, and then I was booked in for a routine scan on the Tuesday. The Monday night, I thought I had a little bit of bleeding, but in fact, it was my waters starting to leak. I didn't know that because I've always been induced. My waters had never broken naturally.
Ah, yeah.
So I had no idea. And I was like, oh, it's just like a light pink color. It's just a little bit of bleeding. Didn't get heavy. Sometimes it wouldn't be there. Um, the next morning, it was a little bit more like red, I guess, so more blood-like than just light. And I said to my husband, oh, I've got my scan anyway. There's no point calling. And he was like, I think we should
Mm,
call, And I was like, okay. So I rang. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning. I rang the birthing unit. I told them what was happening. I live an hour away from the hospital that we were birthing at just because I wanted the same OB that I had for all my other kids when I was living in Sydney. So we did that. Um, so I rang them. They said, just come down, take your time. We're sure everything's fine. So I got there. The midwife checked. She put me on whatever the CTG machine.
mm-hmm.
Um, she said, "No, baby's fine." She said, "Show me the blood loss," and I showed her, and she's like, "Oh, that's hardly anything." And I'm like, "Yeah, see, I told you it was nothing." She's like, "I'll call your OB just in case."
Mm.
Um, he said, "I'll just go for your booked scans. Go and do what you planned on doing. Go and have your scan done." I had an appointment with him that afternoon, like early afternoon, anyway. So then went to the scan. The lady checked all the measurements. She said everything looks good. And then at the end, she said, I better check your cervix. So she did an internal scan. She checked my cervix. And I could tell then that her face dropped. And she said,
It was
oh,
open.
I think I'm going to go and get the doctor, not my obstetrician, like the radiographer doctor. And you kind of know when they come in and say that things aren't great. Um, so the doctor came in and she's pointing at things on the screen and she's saying to me, sure, you haven't noticed any like fluids breaking or your waters? And I'm like, no, nothing like that. And she's like, okay. And I can hear like she's pointing and she's saying there's a lot of fluid in the cervix. And I'm like, and I said to them, I've had a short cervix before, like it's fine. And I remember
Mm,
the sonographer saying to me, you're really calm for someone that's had a short cervix. I said, but I've had it before. I've never had any issues. Like I've been on progesterone, it's
mm.
been fine. And then the doctor that was there said, when do you see your obstetrician? And I said, I think it was like 11 o'clock. And she said, I'm going to phone him. And I said, okay. And she came back in and she said, you need to go straight there. And it's in the same building anyway. So,
Okay.
and I said to my husband, it'll be fine. Worst comes to worst, back on progesterone. They might put a stitch in. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
Um, the moment that I kind of thought we're not fine was walking back into the obstetrician office. The waiting room was full. His office door was open, and I could hear him say to his midwife, where are they? And she turned and she said, oh, they've just walked in. And he got up and he said, you need to come in. And I was like, okay. And he's like, sit down, we need to have a chat. And he said, this is serious. And I said, but I've had a short cervix before. And he said, yeah, but this is serious. Like, your cervix is barely holding in. And he said, we have two options. I put you into hospital and you go into bed rest. Um, and we try and keep the baby in there until 24 weeks. He said, but that
Fuck.
outcome of delivering a baby at 24 weeks is not going to be a good outcome. He said, I don't think you'll get past 24 weeks. And he said, when I say bed rest, it'll be you will not be moving at all. Like, any movement is critical right now. And then I said, well, what's option two? And he said, well, we put a stitch in. And he said, there's risks with that. Obviously, your waters can break. And I said to him, well, how many times have you put a stitch in and how many times have you broken waters? He said, I've never broken waters. I said, well, let's do that then. Like, it was just
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
sense, And I was still a bit naive. So that was the Tuesday. He was due to go overseas on the Friday. And I said to him, so will you do it before you go on holidays? And he said, we're doing it today. And I was like,
Like right
like it
now.
was,
Yeah.
yeah. And then he wanted to know when I last ate, and I had to fill out like the admission form for the hospital. Um, so I walked out of the office. I got to the corridor and I burst into tears. And my husband said, it's going to be fine. We'll put the stitch in, it'll be fine. We went back to the birthing unit. We waited and waited and waited. And they said, you should be going in around 2 o'clock. I don't know exactly when I went in, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't until about 5 o'clock. And then I had the surgery. By the time I went from my OB's office in the morning, say around 11, and having the surgery at 5, I became 3 centimeters dilated and my waters were bulging.
Oh.
Um, they gave me a general anesthetic for the surgery, but he had to turn the bed so I was on my head to push the waters back because he could not get the stitch in without that. The waters were pushing so far against my cervix that if he tried to put the stitch in with me lying flat, he would have broken my waters. I remember
Holy
waking up in
heck.
recovery. Yeah, so it was full on. Like, I woke up in recovery. I had the world's worst headache, obviously from being on my head for like an hour and a half or something. He ended up calling in another surgeon to come and help him because he couldn't do it by himself.
Mm.
Um, so he saw me in recovery, and I was so sick from the anesthetic that I just kept vomiting. And he said to the nurse that was next to me, you need to stop that vomiting now because any pressure down there is going to burst those waters like
Fuck.
So they gave me a really strong dose of Phenergan to knock me out, which worked. I was completely out of it. The vomiting stopped. I went to sleep. I got taken back up to the birthing unit. My husband was there. I
Meanwhile,
we
you've got a 7-month old at home, right? Like I'm
Yeah,
just trying to like Harrison's 7 months old and he's at home and yeah.
yeah, like it was chaos. My friend was looking after him. The kids were at school. Like it was just,
Mm.
yeah, it was mental. Anyway, so
So
we
scary.
we I went back up to the birthing unit. The My husband was there. I don't remember the conversation we had, but I remember him saying that my obstetrician had called him to say that, the next 24 hours were pretty critical. Um, and then I went to sleep. The midwife kept coming in throughout the night. Um, at around 6 o'clock, she came in and she said, I just want to check your pad. And I still had a catheter in anyway. And she said, do you feel like your waters have broken? And I said, no, I haven't felt anything. And she's like, okay, I'll be back. And she came in again and she said, are you sure you don't feel like your waters are broken? And I said to her, well, I've had 4 pregnancies. I've actually never had my waters break naturally, so I don't know what it feels like. But no, I
Mm.
don't think they're broken. And she
Mm.
said, I'm just going to call your obstetrician. And I was like, okay. So, you know, he came in, he checked, and um, he did an internal. He said to me that they hadn't broken completely, but they were leaking a lot more than what they were.
Mm.
So now I was at risk of having an infection. He got another obstetrician to come in to just confirm, and she said the same thing. She said, "Yeah, they're gonna go." So he said we need
Meaning
to
the
take the
meaning
stitch
the
out.
waters are about to break. Is that
Yeah,
like they're going to
yeah,
go,
they were
and the
going to
waters are going to
completely.
break?
Yeah. So he said we need to take the stitch out. Um, because if those waters break, because I had past history of having very quick labours, if my waters broke and then labour progressed really quickly, I would have been in a lot of trouble. So
Right. Okay.
um, I kind of had to negotiate with him a little bit and say, well, I don't want you to take the stitch out until my husband got there because I didn't want him to miss out on Archie being born.
Mm.
So he was okay with that. He said, well, tell him to hurry up, basically. Um, so we were waiting for him to come to the hospital. As I said, we lived an hour away, so he was getting kids to school and organising all of that, and then he headed down the
So this was the
freeway.
next day. Was this the next
That
day?
was the
Was it?
next day. Yeah,
Okay.
that was the
Yeah.
next day. Um, between him arriving at the hospital, like just the social worker came in, and I've never really had experience with social workers before, but it was to me a pretty horrible experience.
Mm.
So Archie was still very much alive at that point in time. His heart was still beating, and she handed me a piece of paper and said, "You've got to choose a funeral home." And I was like, "Okay." And she's like, well, I don't really know funeral homes up your area, but these are the Sydney
What?
ones. Yeah. She handed me this piece of paper when my child was still alive. And she said, oh, you've got to just be careful because some of them take advantage of parents that have lost their children. And I was like, okay. And then by that time, my husband walked in and I just couldn't, like, I couldn't even look at her. I still remember my body was how I was positioned on the bed. My head was turned. I just wanted her to leave. Like, I was like, just
Absolutely.
leave, And she said to me, it's normal to feel upset after he's born. And it's normal to have grief and feel grief. And she said, but after 6 weeks, if it's still consuming you, you probably need some help. And I was like, so you're telling me after 6 weeks I'm not going to grieve anymore? Or, like it
Mm.
just didn't make sense to me. So I was very anti the social worker. And I know
Absolutely
she was just
valid.
doing her job, but I just thought, you're not doing your job that well.
No.
Um,
No, that's awful.
she didn't really explain the process of, even things like what happens when he's born, like where does he go or anything. Like none of that was really explained by her. Like the midwife did, but she didn't. So she left because I think she could tell that my body language was not great.
Yeah.
So my obstetrician came back in. He removed the stitch, and then he said, "We're just going to wait and see what happens." He removed the stitch, and then a little bit after, I can't remember exactly time wise, but I stood up and my waters broke properly. Um, so the midwife was aware of that, and then um, we waited and we waited and waited, and I had nothing happen. No contractions, nothing at all. So he decided to put me on the drip to
Mm.
just try and get my contractions to start.
So
And I
basically
ended up being on
induced
the,
the labor.
yeah, so I ended up being on the highest dose. Um, and I felt nothing. I didn't have a single contraction the whole entire time. And in my mind, it was like my body was saying, we shouldn't, this baby should not be being born. Like,
Mm.
um, so in the end, he came in and he said to me, "You don't have a choice. You're just going to have to push." And I said, "How do you push when you don't have any contractions?" It was,
Mm.
yeah, it was, and I think that was around maybe 5 o'clock. And I think I ended up pushing for 2.5 hours. And it was going from the bed to them asking me to sit on the toilet to see if that
Oh, it's
position
so
would get him to
awful.
move. And they kept saying to me, "Are you sure you don't feel anything?" And I'm like, "No, I don't feel anything at all." Finally, the pushing worked and he ended up coming out breech, but he got stuck.
Oh,
So,
fuck. Did they
yeah,
know
so
he
he
was
started,
breech?
no, so he started to come out feet first. First, it was more like stomach first and then feet. And then my obstetrician pushed him back up to try and turn him. And then so his feet came out completely first. And then, and this is going to be very graphic, so I'm going to say that as a little warning.
Go
But
for it.
um, then, so his feet were there and he was stuck again. So they told me to walk from the bed to the toilet to try the toilet thing again. I could feel his legs dangling between me, which is horrific. It was awful to know that. I went back to the toilet and I was like, nothing is happening. Um, we went back to the bed again and they said, keep pushing. And then my obstetrician said, we've got one last shot at this, otherwise I have to take you to surgery. And he said, I'm going to give you an asthma medication. So they injected an asthma medication into me. So by that point, it was his feet and stomach were out, but my cervix had closed around his neck, essentially. So we're not 100% sure, but we would say that that is probably the point that he passed away because he suffocated to death. Um, so they gave me this asthma medication, um, and they just said, keep pushing, keep pushing. And I remember thinking, like, how much do you want me to push? Like, I just can't do it.
Mm.
Um, but the medication ended up working, thankfully. Um, so
What was
he
it
was,
designed to do? Was it designed to relax your cervix or something?
yeah, it was designed to relax my cervix enough just to get him out.
Yeah.
Um, my obstetrician he didn't tell me this at the time, but he told me at my 6-week checkup that he was very concerned that his head was going to separate from his body
Oh,
just
fuck.
because, yeah, just about how stuck he got. That
Fuck.
he said that it got to a point where he said to the midwife, like, I think we're in trouble here, like we're,
Fuck.
so that was yeah,
How,
that happened.
how did they not know he was breech? Like, this is the thing that blows my fucking mind. They don't scan us when we go in for labor or even go in for a cesarean. What would it take
Yeah,
to grab an ultrasound machine and just whiz it over, right? My OB, I was told that they just feel. Well,
yeah,
feeling is wrong because when
yeah,
they were about to cut me open, they looked up, my OB looked up at the pediatrician and he said, breech. But she
yeah,
wasn't, she was transverse. And he goes,
yeah.
well, I felt and it felt like she was breech. So I had a planned cesarean because she was breech. Why, when you were in labor, would they not have just quickly scanned to see the position of the baby? Like,
I
that is
think
so.
because he was so, like, his gestation was so young that
He would have been so
obviously,
small anyway.
yeah, the further you get along, the baby generally is in the right position. I know in some cases they're not, but in this case, it was kind of like, well, regardless of the position, he should come out easily because of his
Because he's so
size.
small. Yeah.
Um, and they was like, I remember saying to them at the beginning, like, will this be like a normal labor? Will I feel things? Will I not feel things?
Mm.
The midwife said, well, in her experience, you will get some mild cramping, maybe some minor contractions, um, but generally the baby kind of just falls out. Well, that didn't happen to me at all. It was like the opposite effect of, it felt like to me that my body did not want to give birth that day.
Mm.
So he was born. He obviously didn't take a breath because he got stuck and that, was suffocated. So yeah, so they cleaned him up. I had to then deliver the placenta, which again I had the same issue with because my body was like, what are you doing? So they gave me medication for that. They were concerned that I hadn't. They, my obstetrician was more concerned about making sure it came out properly and whole. So he like triple checked that over and over and over, turned it over and all, and he said, I think it's fine. Um, so then we had some time with Archie, and then another midwife came in to say that she was going to go and dress him. So she did that. I went and had a quick shower and I started shaking, and my husband was like, are you cold? And I was like, no, I think I'm in shock. Like it was, I
Absolutely.
couldn't stop shaking. And then the midwife brought him back in, so we had time with him. Heartfelt wouldn't come and take photos. They said that his gestation wasn't enough. Well, that's what the midwife told me. So I was a bit upset about that. But then a few days later, I messaged them on their Facebook page and thought, well, maybe they could come and take photos at the funeral home. And they gave me a number to ring, and I called this lady, and she said, I'll speak to someone. She said, does he look like a baby? And I said, yes, he does. Like, he's fully formed. He's just small. And she said, well, that's their biggest thing, like under 22 weeks is. I said, well, he was almost 22 weeks. He was like 21, 5 days, something. So, and then I never heard back from them. So I was like, what are we going to do?
Mm.
So the lady that did our wedding photos, I messaged her and I was like, this is going to be completely left field, and I understand if you don't want to do that, but could you please come and take some photos? And she agreed, and I said to her, I don't care what it's going to cost, I'll pay whatever.
Mm.
So she agreed and she came to the funeral home. But so the photos we got at the hospital were just on our phones, which is fine, we've still got them. But
Yeah.
and then it got to a point where um, I think we were there for maybe 4 or 5 hours afterwards, and I didn't want to stay in the hospital because I didn't want to go into the maternity ward. That was my
Yeah.
biggest thing. Um, so they weren't in a hurry to push me out the door. My obstetrician wanted me ideally to stay the night. He was concerned that I would get an infection because of how much I was poke and prodded. So he
Mm.
gave me IV antibiotics before I left. Um, but I was so anti going on that maternity ward. But then I was also conflicted because I was leaving Archie behind.
Yeah.
So that was really hard to like. I didn't want to go into the maternity ward when you've got all these mothers with their newborn babies, and there I am, not with mine. So I struggled with that, like trying to make that decision about what to do and not what to do. And I was also cautious about going home to the other kids as well. Like they obviously knew what was happening. We called them in the afternoon before he was born because I didn't want them to go to bed and then wake up the next day and kind of go, well, what's happened? So
Yeah.
we rang them and just explained that he was going to be born, but he was going to be too little. Um,
Oh.
and my 12-year-old, we've got like a security camera at our front door, and he was here with my mum and one of my friends, and I watched him. like he got on his bike and he left the house. And I was thinking, that's the worst possible thing that he could have done. Like, why did they just let him go? But then, in the other point of view, like, I could see that, they were saying he was just an emotional mess and he needed
Some
space,
space.
Um, but yeah, he didn't go far. He just rode around our block and came back again. But, here I was
Oh.
an hour away and I'm like, I've just broken his heart. And I'm not there to help him. So
Mm.
that was really hard as well. Um, so it was just like constant to and froing, how do you um so
Mm.
yeah, we had that time in
How
the
do you be with,
hospital.
you've got your children here and then you've got Archie
Yeah,
there, and yeah, it would have been so hard.
yeah. So we had our time in the hospital, walking out of the delivery unit with a box. They handed us a box with stuff in it. There was a man walking in with like obviously his wife's bags and stuff, and I remember thinking, you're walking in to meet your baby, and we've walked out with no baby. Um, and that was extremely difficult, like that moment. Um, and then we got home, I think around 11 o'clock. My mum was still here. She didn't know what to say to me. Um, she basically got up and walked out and left. She just did not know
Oh.
what to say at all. Like, my husband messaged her to say that he would be born, and she just wrote back and said, okay. And that was it. Because I don't think she really knew what to say.
Yeah.
The little kids are in bed. My 12-year-old was still up. He wanted to like see me. Um, and then I didn't know what to do. And this is going to sound so stupid, but I literally like rage cleaned the house. I
Okay. Yeah.
I wa- I was like, the lounge room is a mess. So why is it so messy? And I literally like cleaned
Ah.
everything up. And my husband was like, you need to stop. Like, you need to go to bed.
Mm.
Um, So eventually I did go to bed and I just stared at
How
the ceiling.
interesting. It's like you must have just gone into mum mode of just like,
Yeah,
okay, get the house in order, like, this has happened, but I need to fix this and I need to do this.
yeah,
And also because you probably knew that you're going to lay in bed, and then that's when reality sets in, if it
that's
even
right.
sets in that
Yeah.
quickly. But yeah.
So yeah, I did eventually I went to bed. My husband fell asleep really quickly and I remember thinking like, how can you be asleep? Like, how are you sleeping? And I'm just staring at the ceiling.
Mm.
Um and I don't even remember what time I fell asleep, but it was I think maybe like 4 or 5 a.m. And then the
Yeah.
next day, a friend of mine who lives out in Bathurst, who I've been friends with for a million years, when I was in hospital, I said to her, I need you to find me a funeral home because I just can't do it. And she was like,
Yeah.
yep, onto it, don't worry. Um, so she rang around and she found a funeral home. She narrowed it down to two and she said, out of the two, this is the one I would pick. And I said, okay, just organise it. I
Yeah.
was just so, like, I don't know, not in reality that I was just like, I'm
Yeah.
not doing that. Um, so she spoke to them and she gave them my details. And the one good thing was that the funeral director, his name was Michael, he rang me that afternoon. I wasn't expecting the call, so um, didn't recognize the number, but I thought I better answer it. And he said where it was calling from. And I thought, why are you calling me? You're meant to be dealing with my friend. But he
Mm.
said to me, I think it's really important that you have a say in this because you need to make the decisions for Archie. And he said, I can come to you or you can come to me, whatever you prefer. Um, and then he said, and we've already picked Archie up. And I was like, okay, all right. So that was like
Yeah.
a big thing for me. It was, I went from I don't want anything to do with the funeral to, well, we need to have this conversation. Um,
Yeah.
so later that afternoon, we went and met with him. Um, one thing that, which I changed was he said, oh, obviously a baby funeral is very difficult because it's not like it's a grown up funeral where you've got stories to share about them or anything like that. And he said, so I can just pick the readings and things for you if you want. And I was like, no, I want to pick everything. Like, that's important to me.
Yeah.
So we went through and picked everything. So we did that. There were some things that, my husband and I wanted to walk in with his coffin. He kind of said, well, that might be confronting for other people. And I was like, I don't care. you know,
Yep.
I just don't care. I asked if he would be willing for us to have time with Archie there, and he said yes. So that was good of him.
Yeah.
Um, so we were able the following Monday, we were able to go and spend time with him there. The older kids came with us. I didn't take the little kids because I thought I was protecting them. Hindsight, I think I probably would have taken them. I think that
Yeah.
it would have been they would have been able to process their grief easier or differently to how they do it now. They've obviously seen
Okay.
photos of him. Um, they've all asked me, like, why didn't you let us come and cuddle him? And I've said, like, I was
Oh,
trying to
fuck.
protect you. Um,
Hmm.
so,
That's so
you
hard.
think you're doing the right thing, but are you actually? I don't know.
Mm.
So, um, then at the funeral home, I said, oh, can I have the blanket that he had at the hospital? I just assumed that it was sent with him. Um, and they said he didn't come in a blanket. They wrapped him in like a white sheet type thing, and he had his beanie
Oh.
on. And I was like, "So where's the blanket?" And he said, "I don't know. It wasn't given to us." And so I rang the hospital and I rang the birthing unit and I just explained what happened. I said my son was stillborn there. So that I think that was the Monday, so it was like the Wednesday before that he was born. And
Hmm.
then she said, I'll get the midwife that was looking after you to call you back when she's on tonight. She's on night shift. And I said, okay. She didn't call. The next day, the unit manager, the nursing unit manager called me and she said, we don't have the blanket. It's been discarded. She said, you
Oh
didn't
no.
ask for the blanket. And I said, I didn't think to ask for the blanket. Like, I just lost my child. And then she said, but I found another one that looks similar. You can have that. And I paused and she said, well, the other one had his blood and fluid on it. And I said to her, that was the whole reason I wanted that blanket. I
Mm.
don't want
Ex-
a clean, fresh blanket. I wanted that blanket. Um, so she apologized and she just said, maybe you should have been asked if you wanted the blanket. And
Yes, you
I was
should
like,
have been
yeah.
asked, not you should have asked.
Not just assumed that I would have asked for it if I wanted it because I wasn't thinking straight at all.
Mm.
So the funeral home were good in the sense of um, I got an angel gown made from my wedding dress. He
Oh.
had an angel gown on from obviously someone that donated one. Um, I was really funny about I didn't want him to be cremated in my angel gown because I wanted to because it was made for his size. I wanted to keep that. Um,
Mm.
so they put it on him and then took it off him, so I
Okay.
could keep.
Yeah.
They gave me his beanie back, so at least I've got the beanie because that was originally on him. And they said, "Well, he can be cremated with that, or we can give it back to you." And I said, "No, I want that back."
Mm.
So I probably drove them nuts with my little requests on the,
Mm.
on the way, but um,
I'm so
they
glad that they let I'm so glad that they, did all those things for you, and
Yeah,
I'm sure you didn't
yeah,
drive them mad. I'm sure they knew exactly where you were coming from.
yeah. So it was just, the hospital didn't take handprints, so the funeral home took handprints. I don't know why they didn't, but they just gave us footprints. Um, so they took handprints for me, and gave me that, and so it was good in that regard. Um,
Mm,
so yeah, it was like a whirlwind few days of just so much happening. Um,
mm,
his birth was quite traumatic for me, not just in the sense of losing him,
absolutely.
but just the physical aspect of it was traumatic. Um, and then you just deal with the after effects of how life continues to move on.
Mm,
I had a bit of a mind battle because the funeral home give you all, sorry, the hospital give you all this paperwork to register your stillbirth, and you receive a birth certificate in the mail that says that they're stillborn. The funeral home applied for a death certificate and it was rejected. So they said that because he was stillborn and didn't take a breath, he's not warranted to have a death certificate.
what?
Yeah, so I looked into that and I was like, surely that's wrong. But apparently in New South Wales, especially a baby that's of smaller gestation, say like, between 22 weeks and 25 weeks, it's up to the discretion of birth, deaths, and marriages. But in most cases, um, a death certificate is not given for a stillborn baby in New South Wales because they didn't take a breath. So if you Google that, it comes up and says, nope, you don't get one.
Fuck.
Yeah, which
I,
I struggled with because I was like,
of
and I know it
course.
sounds petty, it sounds really stupid, um, but they give you a birth certificate.
I,
So
I
why
think
do
that's
they
what I'm
not give
most
you a
blown
death
away.
certificate?
Like, I think that, yeah, I think that's the strangest part. It's like, but hold on, you're acknowledging that he was born, but you haven't acknowledged that
Yeah,
he's died.
no.
It would almost
So
make more sense if they did it the other way around, where they
that's right.
acknowledged his passing, which would still be equally as traumatic to not acknowledge his birth, but that would make more sense than the way they've done it. So you now have a
Yeah,
birth certificate for your child, but no death certificate, so he should be here.
yeah. So we've got a birth certificate that has his name on there, and in brackets it says stillborn, and it looks like a normal birth certificate that you get for any child, um, and no death certificate. And that was
I
one of the out of all of it, that was one of the most head fucky things. Sorry for my language.
yep.
To comprehend because it just didn't make sense to me. Like, how can you
It
say no?
doesn't make sense.
And then I got an email from the funeral home to say that the application's been cancelled. And I assumed that because it was cancelled that I would have at least received a letter from Birth, Deaths and Marriages to say it had been cancelled, and I just
Mm.
had nothing. Nothing at all.
And I guess, like, logistically, my brain is going, okay, so your birth certificate is going to say the date and the time, but the death certificate would say what? If I'm looking from their perspective, for
Yeah,
us or for you, you're like, okay, well, it would say the same date and of similar time if they have to put the
yeah,
time on there. Otherwise, it would just say the same date. And now I'm just trying to think back to Crystal. Crystal was one of the girls I interviewed on the podcast. She lost baby Whitaker 3 years ago. Baby Whitaker passed away 4 days before she birthed her. So her date of death and her date of birth are 4 days apart, but in the opposite of.
right, yeah,
And I'm trying to think of what happened with their birth certificate and death certificate, or if there was one. I know that in one of the interviews, somebody talked about receiving a birth certificate that just had deceased stamped on it or something like that awful. Or maybe that was
yeah.
someone over in
It's
Canada.
terrible.
Like it just, it's. neither way of any of these things is a nice way to do it. Like, that shouldn't be, like you're saying, out of everything, that was the most head fucked part. And that's something that I believe could easily be changed with legislation. That,
That's right.
and and you're saying that it's to their discretion. Well, how do they decide who they want to give one to and who they don't? Like, it's just someone
That's
sitting there.
right. Yeah.
Whoa.
And the funeral director, he said to me, like, you might not get one because of his gestation. And I think even he was surprised that it was just across the board. If you have a stillborn baby, you don't get one. So if he
And
had,
just in
so
New
he was
South
born at,
Wales.
so he was born at 7:31 p.m. So had he taken a breath and lived for 10 minutes, I would have received a death certificate. But because he did
Wow.
not take a breath, um, there's no certificate.
And like when we got Millie's, so we got her birth certificate and we got her death certificate, and I do recall those things arriving and it being like, holy fuck, like this is reality.
Yeah,
And it said her the wrong age. It said that she was 1 day old and she was 6 days old. And I just kind of like didn't want to deal with it, so I just put it in our safe and was like, it's fine. And then somebody else sent me a message like, oh my gosh, my baby's death certificate arrived and it has the wrong age on it. And I was like, oh, so does ours. And when as soon as I told the funeral home, she was like, absolutely not. This is not okay. And she complained and sent it back and she did all that for me and they reissued
yeah,
it. So it's like such an important document, but they can get something like that so wrong,
that's right. Yeah,
And if it is such an important document that you don't deserve one because your baby didn't breathe, then how can they then make such easy mistakes on mine, being that
yeah,
her age was wrong? Like, I
that's
just,
exactly right.
I'm so
So,
sorry that was your experience. That's really awful.
yeah, it was just, it was like one thing after another, a few weeks after I lost Archie, I went to my GP. I took one of my kids, and I can't actually remember which child or what I was there for because
Mm.
I walked into my GP's office and she said to me, oh, you're nearly 25 weeks pregnant. You're almost there. And I was like, sorry. And I said, did you not receive a letter from my obstetrician? And she said, yeah, I did. And I was like, did you read the letter? And I said, the baby was stillborn. And she said, no, that's not the letter I got. And she opened the letter on the computer and it said that I presented at hospital with membranes leaking. It explained my birth. At the bottom, my obstetrician wrote that the baby was stillborn. He wrote the name. He wrote that we were planning a funeral. He wrote that he planned on checking in with me afterwards. And she said to me, I'm really sorry, I only read the first line that said I presented at hospital, and then read the bottom line that said he would follow up with me. So she just assumed that everything was fine. So she did not read the full letter. And I was completely gobsmacked that she even said that. And I remember thinking, you are never ever going to do that again to anyone else because you will read every bit of correspondence that comes through. And as I said, like that, just I can't even remember why I was there or for which child because that completely overtook the whole appointment.
Have you ever been back to see her? I feel like I don't know if I could ever see that woman again.
I've been back once, but I kind of feel like should I keep going back? Like it's like burnt into my mind, and I'm just like,
Absolutely.
maybe I should not be going back there. And I've thought about it, like
Mm.
maybe that was my sign to go and find a new doctor
I mean,
because,
it's up to you. Everyone would take that scenario different, but I just picture walking in there and then, like when we lost Millie, my GP booked me in the next day.
yeah,
What I didn't realize is that she's a bit tech challenged. She booked in to call me, but she didn't tell me that. So I got this text saying that I have to go see her at 8 o'clock the next morning. And I was like, I'm going in. Went in my jammies, like literally the
yeah,
day after we got out of the hospital. And I wasn't meant to be there. They were just going to phone me. But she took me into the room and she cried with me. she held
Yeah.
my hands and she was like, I am so sorry. Like, what has happened? Like, and then I just
Yeah.
told her everything and she just cried with me, you know, and that's a good GP. That's a GP
Yeah.
that should be in that role, you know, not one that just shuffles through some. And it, like, admittedly, Dr. Luna was expecting to get a letter about Milli's birth and all the other things. So she
Yeah.
was, it wasn't at 22 weeks, you know, so not defending your GP at all, but she probably got it 22 weeks. Oh yeah, she's okay. Da 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 da. Like, but
That's right.
that's still not okay. Fucking read every
Yeah.
fucking detail.
That's right. You know, he, as I said, my obstetrician went above and beyond. Like, he put in his name, he put in when we were planning a funeral, like, he put everything in there, and she still just read the first line.
That's
And
awful.
yeah, and as I said, I can't remember even why I was there. I know it was for one of the kids, but I can't remember why or who, or because it just completely overtook the whole appointment. And I remember walking out of there and like just thinking, what the fuck was that? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's awful. And it
so
will continue. Like, I feel like that shit just never stops. Like, sometimes
that's
things
right.
just get said, or it's just the life of being a lost parent now, is that
Yeah,
we will constantly be triggered. And I guess it's up to us how we handle it. And I think the stronger I get, also the harder it gets, because whereas I used to just break down, whereas now I like hold my shit together, but then I come home and just like sleep for 4 hours because I've just been like,
yeah,
be sane, be sane, be sane. Don't say anything. Don't react. Like, rah, rah, rah,
yeah.
rah, you know. And then you come home and you're like, okay, I just need to sleep for a week. Except you can't do that because you have other kids to raise. So it's like, it's
Sorry, say again.
so sorry. You know, there's so many challenges around that. You know, you can't come home and sleep for a week. You have to be a mum to all these other kids as well. So,
That's right. Yeah. So it's definitely a journey.
yeah,
And, you know, everyone's journey is very different because,
yeah,
you know, everyone grieves differently. Um, for me, I think if I didn't have the other kids, I think I would be in a much worse place just because I don't think I would have the motivation to want to do anything.
mm-hmm.
Um, so, yeah, I'm grateful that
It's hard.
they're there, but it doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily make it easier. You just kind of manage it a bit better. So,
Yeah. And I think also, like you were saying at the beginning of the podcast, is that like you also have to manage their grief and their hurt and their trauma and their
that's
pain
right.
and all of those things. So that's like, again, just another element. And I don't know because I haven't looked into it myself, but I don't know if there is many resources out there. Obviously, this podcast is great because people can all share their stories about what they're doing
Yeah.
that is working or not working with their kids. But I don't know if you have resources and help for how to help grieving kids that lose a sibling.
There's on the SANS website, they have like a booklet about how to, I guess, speak to your kids and navigate that. Um,
Oh, that's good.
so that a friend of mine actually sent that to me when before I knew that, like we knew that Archie wasn't going to make it before I went into labour. She was like, "Read this."
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so there is plenty of books out there. There's the other thing that, you know, I guess because my kids are school age, they've got access to their school counsellor.
Oh,
My son
great.
sees her quite regularly, and
Yeah.
she knows everything that's happened. So she's able to navigate that with him, and he enjoys going to see her and finds it beneficial. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, and they all manage their grief very differently. Like my middle child, she doesn't really say much about it at all. Um, she doesn't even really cry that much about it. And I don't know if that's like later on it might hit her or
Mm.
but then Mia, who's like the second youngest, she is very vocal about it. You know, she, as I said, she says goodnight to him every night. She takes, in the hospital, my husband bought like this little lamb that he had, and that was like his first little toy, and she takes that to bed with her. So, like, they all just have their different ways of dealing with it. The older kids don't really talk about it much at all. Like when it happened, they were very adamant they wanted to come to the funeral home to see him. Um,
Mm.
and I kept like just saying to them, it's probably not going to be what you expect, and how he looks might be different to the photos we took and things like that. Um, but they were like, no, we definitely want to come and meet him. So they did that.
And are they glad that they did that? Was that a good decision?
Yeah, it was a good decision, and that's part of seeing how they were and how they reacted, which I don't think was negative at all. Kind of makes me regret not letting the other kids go, but
Mm.
they're obviously they're older, so how they can
Yeah,
process it is very different to say a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old. So um,
absolutely.
so sometimes the younger kids have been upset, and I've said to them, "Do you want to look at photos?" And they say yes. So we scroll through photos and have a look. Um, as I said, Mia will like hold his ashes, and she's like, "I want to hold him." She asks lots of questions because I think she's at that age where they don't really think there's no filter. Like they don't think about
Yeah.
will it upset someone or not. So she just, and it doesn't upset me that she asks the questions, but yeah, she'll ask hundreds of questions like, why did it happen? How did it happen? How did he get born? Like, does it happen to
Mm.
other people? So, last night, all of a sudden, she had this overwhelming thing of grief. Like, she burst into tears. Um, and then she decided that we were, as a family, we were all going to go outside and find the brightest star. And she's like, look, he's shining, that we can see him. Like, he's above our house.
Oh,
Um,
so
so that's just
beautiful.
her way of dealing with it. But they're all
Mm.
different. So it's
Yeah.
just, it is what it is.
Just
And
like we all are as humans, right? Like, they're all
yeah,
their own individual personality and different emotions and different ways, whether you're an empath or etc. So it's
yeah,
just in littler form.
yeah. So yeah,
I will
you
say
just got
on
to
that
make
as
it.
well, one of my biggest regrets is not letting more people meet Millie
Yeah,
after she passed away. I
yeah,
we let as many people as we could meet her while she was in the hospital, still thinking we were going to be bringing her home. We never, like, just didn't think I wasn't going to be bringing her home. But after she passed away, we didn't have many people meet her. And
yeah,
a girl reached out to me the other day and she said, I've just lost my baby. I don't know what to do, blah, blah, blah. And that was my number one. I said, look, you might not agree with this, but this is my take on things. Give people the opportunity to go to the funeral home and meet her and
yeah,
hold her and do all the things, because my dad didn't get to do it, and it breaks my heart all the time, and nor did a lot
yeah,
of people. But there's just a few people that I wish let see her and hold her.
yeah. And I would agree with that. At the funeral home, obviously we had our kids there, but we had my mum and we had my in-laws. The only thing that I probably would have changed about that is I would have staggered the times a little bit more, so the kids and my husband and I had more time with him alone.
Yeah.
So just to stagger that rather than having everyone there at the same time, everyone wanted to like go in and hold him and see him.
Mm.
Um, because at the end, it kind of feel like I don't know if it's selfish me saying this, but I kind of felt like my time there was robbed with him because I
Mm.
was too
Yeah.
worrying about everyone else, and as I said, they all wanted to hold him. Um, so and it's hard for someone, like, if someone keeps walking back into the room to say, I want to have another hold. You can't exactly, like, you don't want to say no to them, but you also
Mm.
want time with your baby. So that would be
That's
probably
so
my only
true.
advice, is like stagger those times just so it's not everyone at the same time. Um,
And I think also when in the moment, I'm like, I don't like saying that I have regrets, because everything felt right in that moment. But I think I was probably in protection mode as well, and like I was like, no, that's my baby and that's my time, and I will hold her. And
yeah,
so maybe that's where I was at in that moment, where it was like I didn't want to share her, essentially.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I agree with that. I was very much the same. It was like, this is my time with my baby, and I don't want to And I remember like walking into the funeral home and they had him like laid out on this nice little satin white bench thing. And
Mm,
I obviously knew what he looked like. I had just seen him a few days prior, but walking in there and just seeing him again, and I just felt like this overwhelming sense of like, that's my baby. And um, even the first time that I saw his coffin, like when the funeral director walked the coffin round to us, and I remember like saying to my husband, "Shit," like, because you don't
tiny.
expect it. It's tiny, and your brain
Mm,
knows that you'll have this tiny baby, but to see a coffin that size, you don't like. It
mm,
didn't register to me at all. Like I was just like, the
mm,
baby's small, but you don't, because I think in most situations, death is generally older people,
yeah,
and that's the thought process of a lot of people, is that death is for older people.
yeah,
So I think that's one thing that makes grief really hard when you've lost a child, um, especially a baby, is it's against the normal,
yeah,
like it shouldn't be happening that way. Um,
absolutely.
so,
And I
and
don't
it's
think
and it's
many
not
people have ever
just
seen a small coffin. Like,
no, that's right.
it's small. Like Dylan and I carried
Yeah,
it in as well, and it was like one. I was on one side, he was on the other, and
yeah,
before the my friend's mum who was running the funeral home, before she brought the coffin out, she said, "I just want to warn you, it's very small." And so that was
yeah,
just such a nice little, oh yeah, like, so it wasn't just a shock of, oh shit,
yeah.
yeah, and it was so
And I think that
light.
the other thing that people probably don't understand unless they've lost their child is, you're not just losing your child, you're losing like that first birthday, the second birthday, them going to school, them graduating high school, getting married, whatever it is, all these
Mm-hmm.
like hopes and dreams that your child you would think would follow or achieve. That's what you grieve for as well. It's not just the sense of we've lost someone, like they've
Mm-hmm.
lost their whole life, uh, and
Yeah,
they didn't get a
it's
chance
so
to live
true.
that life. So it's very different to say, an 80-year-old person passing away who's had a life that they were able to fulfill. Like, you know, well, in my mind, it's like, well, Archie, or same with you with Milli, they didn't get to live their
Mm,
life. So
mm,
that's what's hard, and that's like another element of grief as well. It's completely different layer on top, I guess.
yeah, it's all of the
So
milestones and it's all of the things. And like I was saying earlier, like, her getting her period for the first time, or her wearing makeup, or her, you know, going to school formal, getting married. Like Dylan won't ever be able to walk her down the aisle when she gets married. And, it's all of those things that will forever hurt.
that's right. Yeah. And you compare like to other kids, as well. Like, I should have had a
The
baby at
ones that were
that
born,
age, or
yeah, yeah,
yeah. And even obviously he was born in December, but his due date was actually the beginning of April. So um, leading up to his due date, I felt fine and kind of was like, I think I'll manage this fine. But on his actual due date, it was like, no, like it was,
yeah,
my husband and I had planned, like, we thought maybe we'd go out for lunch or whatever. We ended up spending the day in bed just sleeping, just
yeah,
exhausted and sleeping. Like when Harrison had his nap, we had our nap. Um,
yeah,
and it was just because we couldn't manage to do anything else. And as I said, leading up to it, I was like, yeah, it's fine. I even said to him, if you want to go to work, you can go to work, I'll be okay. He's like, I'm not going to work, I'm staying home. Um, and I felt fine until that morning, and I was like, I'm not fine. Like it was
yeah, yeah.
just, and obviously, I think probably one other big thing that I would say is that grief for men is very different for grief for women. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Fathers and mothers very, very different. So, um, obviously, I think only speaking from personal point of view is that um, I felt a lot of blame and guilt in the sense of I felt like my body failed. So I had caused all this pain for everyone. So I kind of
Mm.
felt like that I'd caused grief for everyone else. Um, my husband felt like he was letting me down because he was upset and couldn't support me in certain times. And then he was also worried about what I went through physically as well. So, it's very different. So we kind of, and it won't work for everyone, but we kind of implemented this system where I said to him at the very beginning when we were going through it quite badly, I would say to him, "What's your number?" And he'd be like, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, out of 10, what's your number?" Like 0, I need help now. 5, I'm okay, or 10, I'm great. Because
Mm.
they don't communicate. They like to
Yeah.
bottle it all up. So it was a lot easier for me to be able to like send him a text and be like, "What's your number at today?" And he'll be like, "I'm at a 6." And I go, "Okay, well, he's okay." But if he said to me, "I'm
Yeah.
at a 1 or a 2," then I'd be like, "Well, you need help and we need to get you some help." Um,
Yeah.
and I know that it won't work for everyone, but that's kind of what worked for us. And by being able to say that to him, if he said to me, I'm low, like I'm a 1 or a 2 or a 3, I would be able to have a conversation with him and say, like, what's triggered that. And I'm not
Yeah.
discounting anything that he's saying, but it was like an opening, I guess, an opening starter to get information
Get
out
them
of him.
talking. It's so great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to talk. And, it's very, I guess, society says men shouldn't speak, they shouldn't have emotion, they shouldn't feel grief, they shouldn't
Mm.
feel depression, they shouldn't feel sad or anger or anything like that. Um, so that was a big thing for me, was that I wanted to make sure that his mental health was okay, because I didn't I knew that it would be very easy for him to get stuck in like a rabbit warren and go into a very dark place. So
Mm.
just checking in with him was important. So yeah,
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. On a scale of 1 to 10, where are you at?
yeah,
And then I think like also I met up with Crystal and Ryan Whitaker's parents a couple of weeks ago for a coffee with a couple of other with another girl, and they are really open in talking about their experiences as husband and wife, and then going on to have
yeah,
so they lost their first child and then going on to have their second child, and they were saying like a lot of the time when one was feeling strong they would hold the other one up and vice versa, but they
yeah,
said at one point during their pregnancy after loss, um, they were both down a lot and they really struggled to bring each other up. But I think the importance of that is like, even when I'm down, like really down, I don't expect Dylan to bring me up. I
yeah,
am fine to be left alone. But
yeah,
I struggled sometimes more when he was always okay, which I think he did to be my strong husband and to hold me up. But I'm like,
yeah.
sometimes like, I just want you to be down with me. Like, just like show me that this is really shit and that I have good, valid reason to be a broken mess.
That's right.
But since my mental health has been stronger and better, he has shown more vulnerable sides and stuff, which is so nice.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that they always want to be the strong one, but it's a huge load to take on to be the strong one all the time. Um,
Absolutely.
and I think that, obviously, just speaking from experience, but I think if you show them that it's okay to be vulnerable and to express their
Mm,
emotions, that you kind of become their safe place and they're happy to do that. Um,
yeah.
and it doesn't need to be, a 3-hour conversation. It's just enough to just know that they're going to be okay, or for them to explain how they're feeling. Um,
Mm,
because trying to get it out of them is very difficult. So
yeah.
yeah,
I think kindness, like Dylan and I communicate really well now, and we're both very kind to each other. Like we don't fight, we don't be mean. I very early on, Dylan was very much a banter kind of person and name calling and cheeky when we first got together, and I was like, I won't have a bar of it. So we don't call each other names,
yeah,
we don't get angry, we just talk. And so we even had a couples counselling session last night on Zoom with our IVF specialist, and even Dylan said to her, like, we just communicate really well. And I think if you can have
Yeah.
open conversations about where each other are at or about anything in life, obviously for us doing IVF, we had to talk about finances and time and what all these things mean. And
Yeah.
you have to do it nicely. Otherwise, it's not going
That's
to
right.
end
And
well.
communication is a huge thing. Like it's very important to be able to communicate about obviously how you're feeling and the situation. And as I said,
Mm,
everyone's grief is differently. Just because you're married to someone that's going through the same thing, they will grieve differently to say how you will, or so I know that his grief
absolutely.
is very different to my grief. But it's
Mm.
just to have an understanding of that. It's important.
I always think of the other people that witness these things. And so, when you were explaining what you were going through, I was thinking of your OB and the nurses and all that. Like when you were upside down and they were trying to save your cervix and your waters and your baby, like imagine the stress they were under. But then also your husband, like witnessing all of these things. I always think of the partners that are there watching this shit
Yeah,
go down. Like, and
yeah,
then how like such a crazy ordeal that you went through birthing Archie, the way they were pushing him back up and trying to like,
yeah,
sometimes we tell these stories as women and it's like you as a human were standing there with a baby coming out and there was people putting things in your body, like what you went
yeah.
through was horrific, and then other people were also watching that. And so it's just
That's
this,
right. Yeah,
when you're telling a story, like I imagine it as a whole, and it's just
yeah.
wild.
I remember when I went to my 6 week checkup, my obstetrician said to me, like, you were so incredibly strong. He said, I don't know if I've ever had a mother that was being that strong. And I was like, it wasn't me. Like, I didn't feel like I was the strong one. I felt like he was the strong one. I know that's his job, but like,
Mm,
he stayed there the whole time. He didn't leave. The midwife, her shift ended and she stayed until he was born. Like, I
mm,
did not see myself as the strong one. Afterwards, like when I thought about it, I was like, well, that's actually a pretty cool thing for him to say. But
yeah.
yeah, like at the time, I was like, here are these people that sacrifice their time with their family. Like, I think her shift ended at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She could have gone home. She stayed till 8 o'clock that night. She's like, I'm not
Mm,
leaving until this baby is born. And, so from like their point of view, they were like looking at me like she's the strong one. But I was looking at them going, these people
thank
haven't
you
left
so
our
much.
side. And,
Yeah.
so different
I
interpretations, I guess.
absolutely, like, yeah, I was thinking of your strength and all of that while you were saying the story, but then I was also, I always think about the other people that are witnessing and what must go through their minds and the stress and anxiety and the pressure that they feel and all of those things as well. Like, it's
Yeah,
just, I think also I want to kind of recap a lot of things because there's been so many amazing points in here. And I never do the podcast as a structure of like asking certain things, but your story has relayed so many things that I think is really good. So, um, heartfelt not coming, I
yes,
think, was a really big thing. I think that's really sad. And I
yeah,
do know some heartfelt photographers. And so I'm going to reach out. And I know that they do have certain, they can't go to every birth. And I know they do have a
yeah,
certain gestation that they do go for. But I think not hearing back from them and then them not communicating the reasons why, etc., or I think that that's a thing. And I think that needs to be
yeah,
discussed. I think the way that you spoke about the grieving siblings and the support that they get and the school counselor and there's books and then there's the SANS website was really good. I think also from a midwife's perspective, like don't throw out things that you think could be valuable to the parent, because I
yeah,
know for us, when I opened my Precious Wings box, I don't know if there was anything that was thrown out, but they had all of Millie's bandages and her wrap, like all of her things
yeah,
that I didn't think ever that they would have kept for us. And I was like, oh my
yeah.
gosh, how cool they kept this. So keeping all the things that just even touched that baby is amazing.
And as I said, like in that moment, I wasn't even thinking about asking for a blanket. But 5 days later, I was like, hang on, I want the blanket. So even
Absolutely.
if they just kept it for like a few weeks, it makes a difference when, emotions are starting to settle a little bit and you can think without
Mm,
a black cloud above your head, um,
mm,
to go, well, and it was even the courage to make the phone call in the first place.
yeah.
So, like, to psych myself up enough to be able to have a conversation, to ring them and say, this is who I am, this is what happened, and I want my blanket. And then to be told we don't have the blanket was like, why? Like, it's something
Mm,
so
mm-hmm.
simple. Just
Yeah.
hand over the blanket. Like, even if you think that, it's stained or whatever it is,
Yeah.
put it in the
It's
box.
the
And if they don't,
stains that
if
we
the family
want.
doesn't want to, yeah, that's right. If the family doesn't want to keep it, they can decide later on when they're thinking clearly
Mm.
if they want it or not. But just put it in the box.
So when we left, because
So,
a lot of people
yeah,
do say that they're so traumatized by leaving the hospital with a box, we actually weren't given
yeah,
anything to leave with on the night because they gave us the option, but they said, look, we still want to do some things with Millie. They wanted to take a lock of her hair and do her footprints and they said, and we'll gather some of her things. And I was like, yep, that's fine. So we picked up the box, or I think a friend picked up the box like a week later. I quite
yeah,
liked that because we didn't leave the hospital with a box, like a lot of people say is traumatic. But
yeah,
also, it gave them time to collect all of her things. And they were things, like I said, that I never would have expected, like her bandages and her,
yeah,
bracelets and stuff, which I'm so stoked with. But her little red book that's never going to be filled in. I mean, that's so fucking
yeah,
traumatic as well. But that's also a thing that, if midwives, etc., are listening, is that, it could be that the box isn't given to the family member right there and then. It's kept, and
yeah,
somebody can go into the room and collect all the things that would be of value that you could open up later and go, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of this.
yeah.
And then the box is delivered later or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, I agree with that.
And then I think also the whole birth, deaths, and marriages thing is just a whole other conversation in itself.
Yeah,
But yeah, I think you've made some amazing points in here, and I think your story is just so incredibly heartbreaking and so many elements to it. There's so many layers, and yeah,
yeah. Every story is heartbreaking. It's just, I think it's important to, you know, if you know someone that has lost a child, keep talking to them about it, say their name. Since we lost Archie, there's people that have never mentioned his name, never said anything about him whatsoever, even like family members. Um, my sister-in-law, who I know will probably listen to this once I share it because she's anything I post about Archie, she's onto. But she has been amazing. Like, she ordered a Bears of Hope in his name that got delivered to our house. We got his urn from Olive and Kin, and as soon as I posted that, she was like, "I'm going to make a donation in his name," um, and all the time she was like, "I want people to know of him, and I don't want him to be forgotten." And as a mum,
hmm.
as a mum, that's like, you can't ask for better than that. So yeah, that's really important to just say their name. Like,
Mm,
you don't have to make a donation, you don't have to do anything else, but if you know, mention them, it makes a huge difference. So,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. He was here and he was born and he is your son and he is important.
so yeah.
Yeah, I get I I get messages all the time from people like, I just saw the most beautiful pink sunset, or I just saw a butterfly, or I saw a feather, or this shop was called Milli, or anything. And I
Yeah,
just it just keeps it keeps their spirit alive, and it's so kind. That was one. I wanted to ask you one more question. At the beginning of it, you said your husband had messaged your mom and said that he was going to be born and he wasn't going to make it, and she just replied okay. Obviously for us, we know that that's not an okay reply, but what would have been, like, if we're going to give advice to people listening, what would have been a response that would be appropriate? I mean, for me, common sense prevails that it would, like, oh my fucking God, this is awful.
yeah.
How can I,
So
like,
her response was actually when he had already been born. So he texted her to say he was born at whatever time it was, like 7:31. And she just said, okay. So she already knew that we were going to lose him. I guess all I can say is that, like, if that was me replying to that message, it would have been like, I'm so sorry. Um, what can I do to help you? And I know that you might
Mm,
not need help right now. You might not be thinking about it, but in a few days' time, what can I do to help?
mm,
Um, because as much as we don't want it to, life keeps moving. um,
yeah.
and you're not thinking straight. So whether it is just leaving groceries at the door or a home cooked meal or,
Mm,
taking kids out to the park for a few hours, whatever it is, you know, find a way to help someone that's lost a baby, because they might say they're fine, they're not fine. Um,
mm,
and they don't know how to navigate that. And 9 times out of the 10, they don't know how to ask for help either, because they don't want to be a
yeah.
burden. So
Yeah.
that's a big
Yeah.
thing. So, and you might reply to that message to say they've lost their baby and you might not hear from them. But it's okay to send another message in a few days' time and say, hey, I'm just checking in. I just want to make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
Um, a friend of mine would just send me love hearts. That
Yeah,
was
that's what I
all.
was going to
Like, it
say.
was
I
just,
quite just emojis are good,
yeah,
and the ones that say like you don't have to reply. I don't expect a reply. I just want you to know I'm thinking of you.
yeah,
Um, I have an old boss that would call and he'd be like, I just wanted you to see a missed call from me, so you know I'm thinking of you.
yeah,
Like it's just just knowing the silence is the worst,
that's
but
right.
just knowing that there's people that care and that love you and that
Yeah.
are saying their names
Like,
and
it doesn't
acknowledging what
have to be
happened
much at
and
all. It's just, as I said, sending a love heart. Just so you know that if you do need something, if you've hit rock bottom, they're the
mm,
people you can message. Um, and they will be there for you and they will listen to you. So, yeah, that's important.
we're frozen.